Yeah, you smell like chicken and you're being a turd. You're like conflicted about how much you see yourself in these women. How much sapphic romance can you have when everybody's trying to kill you? You know what I mean? Hey, what's up? My name is Leah. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another video. So today I'm going to be giving you 30 queer book recommendations to read for Pride Month or all throughout the year. So I personally think that everybody should be reading queer books all throughout the year because they're honestly fabulous, and I have a bunch of recommendations for you from books that I've read through the past few years, and some of them I have picked up just recently this month for Pride Month, and I want to share them with you. But I have 30 of them, and so that's a lot of books to talk about. So we're going to go a little bit fast and furious. Lies and slander! And I'm going to basically just tell you the cool parts and why you should read them. And if you hear any noise in the background, it's my cat eating feathers. So don't mind that. He's being super rambunctious today. So, you know, we gotta do what we gotta do. But the first book I wanted to tell you about is called Liarmouth by John Waters. Now this is one of the weirdest, most probably disturbing books I've ever read in terms of the way that it's written. So this is following this woman named Marcia Sprinkle, and everybody hates her. Dogs hate her, children hates her, her own family's trying to kill her, and she's a suitcase thief and a scammer, and basically this book is a self-proclaimed feel-bad romance, and we're following Martha as she's trying to run from the cops and run from her daughter who is trying to murder her, and she has a romance with this guy who's a dog catcher, and the whole thing is written in like a really weird, like kind of gross, filthy, slightly sexual manner, but it's also really funny. The guy, John Waters, who wrote this book is a filmmaker. It's unlike anything I've ever read before, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for something weird to read, or if you're like, man, I just want like a really fast read. This is really, really perfect for that. And the next one I wanted to talk about is Night's Edge by Liz Karen. So this is a YA horror about vampires, and we're following our main character Mia, who is in high school, and her mom is a vampire, and basically her mom got turned into a vampire throughout the course of her life, and Mia is trying to hide the fact that her mom's a vampire from everyone she knows. She basically has no friends. She can't bring people to the house because they'll find out, and her mom is kind of emotionally abusive. They have this really strange relationship, and Mia is getting to the point where she's ready to go off and live her own life, and she's kind of trapped in a way by her mom because she is basically like able to feed her mom with her own blood. It's very weird, and set in Arizona, and it's got this spooky like set in the desert vibe, and there's this whole thing going on where if the government finds out that you're a vampire, they will basically come and take you away to this facility, and everybody knows there's no cure for vampirism in this world, and so basically if you get taken to the facility, then you're just gone forever. And Mia is trying to cling to the only parent that she has left, and she and her mom have this almost like not parasitic relationship, but her mom is very like emotionally manipulative, but Mia feels like she can't leave her, and she has a lot of like guilt about it. And then one day Mia meets this girl, and she starts having like this kind of romantic relationship with this girl, and she's trying to hide it from her mom, and the story kind of goes from there, and we get to see what happens with Mia and all the vampires in this world that her mom knows, and kind of the politics of their life and the way that Mia grew up. We get these flashbacks, and we get to see them like being on the run from the authorities in the desert and on the run from other vampires and things like that. And it's really interesting, and it's really, really well written, and it's a really fun read, and the audiobook is really good as well. And then the next one I wanted to recommend is called Peach Pit. So this is a collection of short stories, and it's a anthology about a bunch of different stories following women, and some of them are queer and a lot of them are like revenge type stories, and I really, really enjoyed them. This is a really unique collection, and it just recently was published, and basically the back says it's a stunning anthology of fierce and dangerous women, and the 16 stories show women in their most monstrous states as con artists, murderers, cutthroats, scalpers who are ruled by ambition, grief, and spite. Characters for those tired of being told to play nice. Dressed to the nines and morally gray, the stories in this anthology comprise an envelope full of teeth, each one distinct, unsettling, and sharp enough to rip out a throat. So I highly recommend this collection if you like books like Mayfly, where the characters are just like super morally gray and just like have these fits of rage, and they're murderous, but also sometimes you really want to root for them, and you're like conflicted about how much you see yourself in these women. Anyways, it's really, really well written, and I highly recommend it. It's got all kinds of different stories in here. The first story I thought was really fantastic, and it's about this black woman who is really tired tired of all of these mediocre dudes she keeps meeting on dating sites, and so she decides to do something about it. And there's another one here towards the end about this young girl named Amaranth who her dad dies, and then her mom immediately like remarries her dad's business partner, and Amaranth is basically trying to figure out what's going on with them, and she has some suspicions about how her dad died, and she takes it upon herself to get revenge on the person who killed her father.
Revenge!
And the way she does it is so smart. It's a lot of women who create these like schemes and plots to get back at people who have hurt them or have hurt the people that they love. And so there's a lot of really good like cathartic revenge stories in here that I really enjoyed. And the one about Amaranth at the end was really fabulous. The way that the main character had this long game plan, and just the way that she was so smart about it and cunning and...
What, like it's hard?
Fabulous collection, highly recommend. And the next one I wanted to recommend is called Patricia Wants to Cuddle. So this is another really unique story. It's a very short read. It's following these women who are in this dating show. It's kind of like The Bachelor, and they're filming the final season on this island that's off kind of the coast of Seattle and Washington. And supposedly this island has some weird stuff going on. There's a lot of hikers who've gone missing there. And so there's this whole like online chat board where fans of the show are kind of speculating about this island and so on and so forth. And they're talking about the season as it's being filmed, and then there's different chapters from different POVs of the contestants who are on the show, and it's really interesting. So we're mostly following this black woman, I think her name's Renee, and she is really annoyed about being on the show. Basically, her friends want her to go on the show, and she is queer, and she's kind of like, okay, the guy who's the bachelor is a total just sleazebag, and she's just ready for the show to be over. She's kind of just there for the money. And because her friends were like, you should go on the show because it's always these like straight white girls and it should be more diverse and whatever. And so Renee is there and she just hates it. And once they get to this island, Renee starts realizing that there's some weird stuff going on, and some of the girls think that they see like a weird figure in the woods. And basically, if you like cults or Sasquatch or The Bachelor, then you should read this book because it's got a little bit of all of those things. It's short, it's punchy, it's got some like gruesome scenes, and I really enjoyed that. If you've read Devolution by Max Brooks and you like that, that was a Sasquatch horror novel, I think you would like this book. If you like The Bachelor and you want to read about something similar and you like all of the drama, then you should read this book. If you want to read something that's sapphic but it's a little bit different than like your average sapphic romance, then you should read this book. It's fabulous. I highly recommend. It's a really good one for like reading in the summertime if you want like a fun book to read when you're like hanging out in the park. This seems like a weird recommendation for that, but I read it that way and it was fabulous. So it's great. And there's also some almost like mixed media stuff in here about like blog posts and things like that. And there's also parts in the blog about this woman whose sister went missing on this island, and she goes and tries to find her sister, and she wrote these like blog posts about it online, and then eventually the blog posts stop. And so some of the people are finding out that this blog exists and have been reading it, and they're also speculating about what's going on the island and what happened to the girl who went to go find her sister. And there's letters in here, there's all kinds of different stuff, and by the end you realize, you start putting all the pieces together and you realize like what's really going on. It's very creepy. Next up we have another sapphic story called Big Swiss. So this is one that, again, very unique story, beautifully written. There's a lot of descriptions in this book, so if you are one of those people who likes to read about lots of like lavish descriptions of like houses and people's like interpersonal relationships and things like that, I think this one is definitely for you. I wasn't sure what to expect going into this book, but the audiobook is really fantastic, and we're basically following this woman named, I think her name is Gretchen. Anyways, she is working as like a transcriber for a sex therapist, and she becomes fixated on one of the therapist's clients named Big Swiss. And this woman basically had this really like violent incident happen to her when she was younger, and she is now having like issues in her romantic life with her husband. They're trying to have a baby and so on and so forth, but basically our main character becomes like kind of obsessed with this woman because she has a really interesting life, and then she ends up running into this woman in person at the dog park, and the woman has no idea who she is because Gretchen like listens to the therapist sessions on a tape and then like transcribes them for the therapist because he's trying to write a novel or a memoir or something. And so this woman at the dog work has no idea who she is, and our main character gets closer and closer to her and ends up becoming like a big part of her life, and they have this like whole romantic fling, and it's very strange, but it's also really interesting, and there's a lot of interesting discussions in here about a lot of different topics, and I highly recommend it if you're looking for something that is a little weird and a little different, but not necessarily like gross, more of like a study of two queer women and their relationships with each other and with other people, and the way that they view the world and the way that they view like victimhood as well is really interesting. Fascinating book. Next up, we have a novella, and it's called High Times in the Little Parliament. So this is about this woman who is a scribe, and she gets sentenced to go to High Parliament and be a scribe in this like government election kind of thing, basically. And at Parliament, there are these fairies who keep everything in order, and the fairies will like go around and pinch people and stuff. They're not very nice, and our main character ends up befriending a fairy, and they're basically trying to survive Low Parliament. So basically, Low Parliament is where the politicians meet, and if they don't come to an agreement by a certain date, then the entire building floods and kills everybody in it. And so the scribes are basically just there to like transcribe what's happening, but they're also realizing that things are not going well in Low Parliament, and if they don't sort things out politically, then everybody in the building is going to die. And so our main character and her fairy friend are trying to ensure that they don't die, and there's also a lot of like queerness and drugs and like magic mushrooms and interesting discussions, and it's really well done. The audiobook is really good, and it's really short, but it's really fun. It's set in this like fantasy world, and it's just really interesting and very queer and just really funny as well. I found the audiobook to be very, very entertaining. Next up, we have one that I am currently reading, and it's called Someone You Can Build a Nest In. So this is a new 2024 release, and it's sapphic, and we're following this woman who's a monster, and she has these interesting abilities where she can kind of shapeshift into anything. She can kill a person and then wear their skin, or take their organs and pull them into her own body and make them her own organs. And she can also bring inanimate objects into her body and make herself into like this interesting monster. So at one point she like brings a bear trap into her stomach, and the story starts off with her hibernating in her cave, and these monster hunters come into her cave and try to kill her, and she realizes that one of them is from this family that has consistently sent assassins out to try and kill her, and she's pissed. And so basically she goes into the village because she gets injured, and she's trying to find people to eat to be able to like build up her body mass again, but the villagers realize that she's the monster, and they try to kill her again. And she gets injured even worse, and this human woman finds her and thinks that she's also a human and takes care of her and like nurses her back to health, and they end up having this really cool sapphic romance. And our monster gets to know this human woman, and the human woman turns out is part of the family that's been trying to assassinate the monster for many years. And apparently the family thinks that the mother of this monster put a curse on them, and they're all being killed off one by one. But our monster knows that her species does not curse people, and so she's trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And it's really interesting. There's some like political fantasy elements to this. There's a really fun sapphic romance. The monster elements in here are very cool in terms of the way that she can morph her body and the different powers that she has, and the way that she becomes really protective over our main character. And then another part of this story is that our monster has eggs, and she's reached the maturity level where she needs to like lay her eggs. And normally the monsters will lay their eggs inside of a human, and as the babies are like born, they basically like kill the person from the inside out and like eat them, and that's kind of like the human is their nest, if that makes sense. So the story is kind of a combination of like Fledglings by Octavia Butler, because that has the same kind of alien egg element where like the host of the nest gets like eaten basically as the babies grow. So it's kind of like that, and it also has some magical elements that remind me a little bit of Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher in terms of like the whimsical fantasy side of things. And so it's kind of a combination of those two books. So if you like either of those, I would highly recommend this one. It's very magical, whimsical. It's a lot more like a light fantasy tone with also these like interesting magical political elements to it. And then the next two books I want to recommend are in the same graphic novel series. This series is called Unfamiliar, and basically this is based on a webcomic, I believe, and then they put it into two different graphic novel volumes. But I really like these stories because we're following this little witch girl, and her name is Planchette, and she has a little familiar who's a bunny rabbit. His name is Winston, and she moves into this new house, but she doesn't realize that the house is haunted and full of ghosts, and the ghosts keep trying to touch her and mess with her and stuff. And so she goes into town and she ends up befriending these other witches, and they all band together to try and like rid Planchette's house of ghosts. And they realize as they're going along that a lot of these ghosts, if not all of them, were killed by the same person. And so then they realize that there's a murderer, and they are trying to solve these murders, and they're trying to bring the ghosts peace so that they will move on into the afterlife. And the story kind of goes from there, and some of the witches have a little sapphic romance going on. It's very cute, and they all kind of have their own problems and issues, and they try to all like band together and help each other. It's really sweet. I think if you're looking for a graphic novel that's really short and you want something that's a little bit more lighthearted, kind of a palette cleanser with really cute art that has like some spooky elements with the ghosts and stuff, this is a really good series and I highly recommend it. It's only the 2 volumes. I don't think there's going to be any more. Next up, we have another witchy graphic novel called Mooncakes. This is another one that's sapphic, and we're following these 2 characters, and I believe one of them is deaf or like partially deaf, and she like signs and stuff, and she has these 2 I think they're her aunts that she lives with, and they live in this bookshop slash like coffee shop. It's really cool, and they have this back room where they keep all these magical books and stuff, and they've been hearing these rumors that there's this like weird creature in the woods, and some people think it's like a horse demon or something, and they've also been hearing that there's this big white wolf in the woods. And so it turns out the white wolf is this werewolf who went to school with the young witch girl, and I believe they are non-binary, and basically they team up with the witches to try and get rid of this like demon horse thing in the woods. And then there's also like a cult element to this, and there's a lot of different elements to it, but it's very magical and whimsical, and the art style is really beautiful. And I highly recommend, if you're again looking for like a witchy book for like Halloween or Summerween or something like that, this would be great for that. It's a really fast read and I really enjoyed it. Next up, we have a political adult fantasy called The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke. So this is, I believe, an ongoing series, and I know book 2 is out. I think book 3 is coming out fairly soon, but this is a adult desert fantasy, and basically we're following this woman named Tareen, and she was sold as a child to this other government, and they've trained her to be a soldier. And then one day the queen of this kingdom decides to take some soldiers back to this other continent that they've been trying to like colonize, and they take them there because there's like this rebel uprising going on, and Tareen is originally from this other country, and so she's having this like internal conflict of like, I've been trained to be a part of this brigade and I'm really close with my fellow soldiers, but also we're going back to my homeland, and you know, I know that I have family there, and like these are my people, and it's really interesting. And there's a lot of political aspects to this, and Tareen and this queen lady end up having this like sapphic kind of relationship going on, but the relationship is also kind of like fraught and a little bit toxic in some ways because they're on opposite sides of this war. And so as the story progresses, we get to see more of Tareen and the queen interacting, and all of the political fantasy elements are going on in this world, because in this continent that the queen is trying to colonize, the people have this magic. And for a long time, people thought that it was like a myth, because I think the queen kind of like tamped down and was like, magic's not allowed, it's legal now, blah, blah, blah. And Tareen realizes that her people have these really interesting powers and this magic that can be harnessed, and so she's curious about that, but it's really secretive, and the story kind of goes from there. And there's a lot of really cool fight scenes in here if you're into like high action and weird interesting like political dynamics going on between different groups, and there's a lot of talk about war in here, and there's definitely like some interesting things going on in the world itself. But this is a really chunky book, and I think all the books in the series are going to be really chunky. And I will say there were parts in here where the main characters, Tareen and the princess queen lady, really were like irritating. Like there were some things where, you know, it's one of those things where the reader has more information than the character does, but they just made some dumb decisions sometimes, and sometimes that was really infuriating. But I really like the setting, and I really like the world and the magic system, and I think it's going to be a really interesting series. So if you're into desert fantasy, I recommend this one. Next, we have The Girls Ive Been by Tess Sharps. This is a YA novel, and we're following this girl who is stuck at a bank robbery with her current girlfriend and her ex-boyfriend, and they went to drop off money that they raised for some fundraiser at school, and they get stuck in the middle of this bank robbery. These guys come in, lock down the bank, and they're in danger big time. But what they don't know is our main character grew up with a mom who's a con artist, and she would date a bunch of different rich men and then try and con them out of their money, and basically that's how she and her mom survived. And our main character has kind of gotten away from her mother because her mom was very like abusive and was with all these different men who were also abusive. And our main character is like, okay, I need to use my skills that I learned from my mom growing up to try and con these guys into letting us go and not hurting us. And so as the story progresses, each chapter begins with a list of like what supplies or like weapons or whatever she's been able to accumulate from the bank, so like a stapler or whatever, and she lists out what she's got to work with. And then she is like slowly coming up with a plan to try and free herself and her girlfriend and her ex. And there's also this like interpersonal tension between her and the ex-boyfriend who was really into her, and her current girlfriend who is also there that she has a really good relationship with. And the girlfriend is really interesting too because she's really sharp, she's really into like fashion and stuff, but she also has like endometriosis, and so she's having a lot of pain while they're in the bank, and it's a very dangerous situation. The guys who are holding them hostage are armed and not nice, and it's very high action, high suspense, very entertaining. And we also get flashbacks to our main character's childhood growing up, and we get to see what happened with her mom and the way that her mother kind of manipulated her and forced her to pretend to be all kinds of different girls and like dye her hair and wear wigs and come up with all these like lies and fake disguises and everything to try and con these men into different things and keep her and her sister safe. And it's really interesting. Highly recommend. One of these books that I think is really underrated and a really fabulous YA novel. Next, we have What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. So this is a short novella, and it's a horror, and we're following a main character who is non-binary, and I believe their name is Easton. And basically they are going to this house to see their friend who's dying, and she's dying of some mysterious disease, and this is a retelling of the fall of the House of Usher. And so Easton goes and realizes that something is really off about the house, and the animals outside are also acting weird, and there's all these rabbits, these big hares, and they almost like crawl across the ground, and there's a lot of weird fungi around the house, and Easton is trying to uncover what is going on and what is killing their friend. And the story kind of goes from there. It's a very short novella, very spooky, again, a very good one for Halloween or Summerween or anything like that. Very creepy. If you're into like fungi and nature horror, this is definitely for you. Next, we have Into the Riverlands by Nevo. So this is actually an ongoing novella series. This is book 3. This one's my favorite one of the series so far, but each one follows different characters, and a lot of them are queer. And it's set in this fantasy world that's kind of based on like Chinese mythology, kind of. And each novella is following our main character Chi and their bird companion, Almost Brilliant, and they're going around documenting the stories of these different lands. And a lot of the stories involve people who were involved with the royal family, or different magical beings, or like ninjas and assassins and spies and things of that nature. And so each novella is following different people set in a different region of the world, and basically they're trying to transcribe all these different stories so that they have like this historic knowledge of the entire realm. And so she runs into all kinds of interesting people. And in this one, Into the Riverlands, this one's about these people who are basically like ninjas, and there's a throuple in here that's really interesting. And the different characters are kind of known for different things, and eventually these three people get brought together on this random mission, basically, and they kind of fall in love, and people don't really realize that that is what's happening because they each have like code names and stuff, and they have this history of like taking out people and bandits on the road and things like that. But it's interesting because each of these areas in the realm have different historic stories that go along with them. So like book 2 in the series is following these tigers, and there's these tigers that can transform into women, and they have different like adventures that they've gone on and different things that have happened to them. And she is a really interesting character, and they find a lot of ways to learn all of these different stories, especially like really personal stories. And I really love this series. It's very queer, it's very fantastical, and there's a lot of like action and fight scenes in a lot of these stories as well. So if you're into that, this is a good series for you as well. Next up, we have The Lady Upstairs by Haley Sutton. So this one is a adult noir thriller, and we're following this woman who works for this agency, and basically the agency goes around and kills bad men, essentially, or tries not to kill them. Usually what they want to do is like blackmail them, but sometimes people end up dead. And the lady upstairs is basically the boss of this agency, but nobody knows who she is. And so our main character goes on this mission, and she's trying to blackmail this guy, and she brings in this new girl who's new to the agency to like help on this case, basically. And the girl accidentally kills this dude, like shoots him in a hotel. Like, it's a mess. And so our main character goes in and is like, oh my god, the lady upstairs is gonna kill us for this. And so they're trying to like cover it up, and the main character is also trying to figure out who the lady upstairs is because she's starting to do some shady stuff. And the main character is like, I don't know who this woman is, but I think she's gonna try to kill me. The story kind of goes from there, and it's got some sapphic elements to it. It's set in LA, and there's a lot of men that they're going after who are part of like Hollywood, and they're rich like producers and filmmakers and things like that. And there's a lot of scenes in here that are a little bit like the vibes of Mayfly as well, in terms of like the California ritzy Hollywood energy. And there's a lot of dangerous people in this book, and it's got a lot of fun elements to it. Our main character very much has that like espionage, like badass sapphic lady vibe, and she's not afraid to get her hands dirty, and she's really interesting as a character. And this book is just really well written. There's a lot of drama, and there's a lot of suspense, and you just want to figure out what's going to happen next. And I loved it. And I need to read her other book. She has a second book. I'll put the cover up here. I think it's called The Hurricane Blonde. And I need to read that one too, because that's also, I think, sapphic and set in that Hollywood vibe. Very good stuff. Next, we have Role Playing by Kathy Yardley. So this was one that I read for my book club, and this is a romance about this couple who is a little bit older, and they meet online in this like video game chat, basically, and they don't know who the other one is, and they don't know that they live in the same town, but they end up meeting at a party and falling for each other. And the guy is bi, and his family is not okay with that. And the girl has a son, and she has an ex-husband who's awful. And the two of them kind of come together and find like solace in each other, because neither one of them have really been able to like fit in with the people who are like physically in their lives, and they have had issues like making friends in this small town. A lot of people in the town are like kind of shitty. It's a lot of like people who peaked in high school energy, and they end up forming this really beautiful little romance, and they play video games together, and it's really, really cute. And I recommend it if you're looking for a queer romance that has some characters who are a little bit older, and if you're looking for something that again is a little bit different in terms of like being a queer romance. I will say the beginning does not feel super queer, but like halfway through we get more backstory on our hero in the story, and we get to see more of like him trying to come out to his family and that kind of thing, and the way that they are like super awful to him about that. And it's really good. And then next up we have Theydra Our Daughters by Katrina Monroe, and this one is a horror novel about these women, and it's mostly like a generational story, and all of these women are in the same family, and they are each being killed by this monstrous woman who lives in the ocean off the coast of where they live. And basically there's this story that if you have a daughter, once you have the daughter, she will start hearing the voice of this woman calling to her, and the water calls to them, and our main character moves back to her hometown, and she brings her young daughter with her, and that's when she starts hearing the voice again, and being called towards the water, and seeing something in the water off the coast of the shore, and we get to see from different POVs and different chapters of different women in this family and what happened to them, and you slowly get to piece together what this being in the water is and who it is and why it might be killing the women in this family. And it's very interesting if you're into like generational trauma and sort of like a little bit of magic stuff, a little bit of witchy vibes, a lot of vibes of like the ocean and the sea and the beach and mermaids and that kind of energy. I think you will really like this book. It's not like a gory horror. It's not like a lot of horror that I've read. It's more of a subtle horror. Next up, we have another witchy book, and it's called The Invocations by Crystal Sutherland. So this is another newer release, and this is a very witchy book, and I really, really like it. Crystal Sutherland's writing in this is absolutely fantastic, and we're following 3 different women, and one of them is the wealthy daughter of this very rich guy who has had kids with a bunch of different women, and basically she sold her soul to a demon, and then the spell went like really wrong because she didn't know what she was doing. She was just trying to get powers, because in this world, in order to become a witch, you have to sell a piece of your soul to a demon, and you have to have somebody who knows how to do this do the spell for you. And so this girl did the spell herself, and she didn't know what she was doing. She had this old spell book, and she was just trying to get powers, and it went really, really wrong, and now she has really severe pain, and she's since tried to redo the spell multiple times, and it has not worked. And so now she has like 3 different demons bound to her, and she is having a lot of issues, and she's trying to find someone who can help her with her pain and get rid of these demons and like undo the spell that she did wrong. And then we have another girl, her name is Zara, and her sister was murdered, and she's trying to figure out how to bring her sister back to life. She doesn't want to find the killer because she doesn't really care who killed her sister. She just wants her sister back because it's basically the only family member that she has. And then we're following a 3rd girl who basically does magic spells. Her family was all witches, and they were killed, and basically all 3 of these women are kind of coming together to try and figure out what's going on, because they each have their own needs and their own goals, but there's somebody in this town who is murdering witches, and they're trying to figure out who it is and why they're doing it and how to stop it, because basically they're all in danger from this person. And it seems like it's some kind of shadow guy, and in this world usually men do not have powers, and it seems like this guy does. And anyways, the story goes from there, but all of these women are really interesting, and they're really well written and very interesting to follow. I just really like Crystal Sutherland's writing in here. The witchy vibes are very strong, but all of these characters are really well developed in their own right, and they have their own really interesting backstories. And so I never felt like there was a chapter where I was like, oh, I don't want to read this. Like, I want to get back to the main POV that I'm interested in, if that makes sense. Like, they were all really gripping. Next, we have In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. So this is a memoir, and it's following Carmen as she was in college when she was working on her MFA, and she was in this abusive relationship with another woman. And it talks a lot about how there's not a lot of discussions about abuse in queer relationships. And the way that Carmen wrote this is really interesting, because there's these different vignettes in here basically, and they're each written in a different way. And so she basically uses these different like literary lenses to look at her relationship with this woman and kind of, you know, come to terms with it and unpack that a little bit. And so it's really interesting on so many levels. It's fascinating subject material. It's really sad and at times really hard to read, but the way that she wrote it is really beautiful, and it's really well done on like a nonfiction memoir craft level. If you're into that kind of stuff, yeah, it's one that I read when I was in a nonfiction class in college, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of those books that I read and it kind of like changed my brain chemistry a little bit. So I feel like if you've ever been in like an emotionally abusive relationship or physically abusive in any way, it could be triggering for you. It could be cathartic for you depending on where you're at. But I think it's really interesting on so many levels. She definitely did her research into like stories on queer abuse and lack of stories on queer abuse. And it's really fascinating. One of my favorite vignettes in here that is like stuck with me for a really long time, she looked at her relationship through the lens of like a fictional story and kind of like personified these different creatures in place of like her and this woman, and kind of told her story through that lens in a way where you're like, oh wow, that hits really super hard when you look at it like that. And some of the literary lenses that she chose to like look at her own story through made it that much more impactful to the reader, and it's fabulous. If you have not read this and you like nonfiction or memoirs, you absolutely need to read it. It's a must read. It's a requirement. That's all I have to say. Next, we have One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. So this is one of my favorite queer books. I don't really know why. There's something about the way that it's written, I think, that really hits. And we're following this girl who's in college and she's trying to find herself. She's transferred to multiple different schools, changed her major like 4 or 5 times. She's just trying to figure out who she is and what she wants. And she ends up meeting this girl on the subway named Jane. And Jane, it turns out, is somehow stuck in the subway. And she's from like the 1950s or something like that, I think. And she's just been like stuck on the subway for like years. She's trapped there. There's some kind of like, I don't know, weird thing that's tying her to the subway. That's not really the important part. The important part is our main character, August, trying to figure out who she is. And she has this sapphic relationship with Jane, and it's really sweet. And there's also a really cool friend group in here. And I think that's part of why I really enjoyed it too, is because the characters in here really feel like they're real. And some of the situations that they find themselves in and the discussions that they're having are really impactful when you're in that phase of your life, when you're in college and you're like in your early 20s, you're trying to find yourself and figure yourself out. This is the book for you. Absolutely 100%. It's fabulous. I've read it twice. Beautiful. Well done. Really fast read too if you're looking for something good to read for like a queer readathon. If you're wondering what I'm doing, Rigby is here being a ragdoll. Yes, I know you're being a gremlin. I'm aware. Next up we have Pet by Kweke Emezi. So this is a middle grade novel and it's about monsters, but not in the traditional sense. So basically we're following this girl and she is told by her parents that in this world there used to be monsters, and monsters were basically people who did bad things to other people. And one day our main character is in her mom's art studio, and her mom is a painter, and she like cuts her finger and bleeds on one of the paintings by accident. And this creature that her mother has painted that has like feathers and stuff, it's almost like a chimera kind of thing, it comes to life and it comes out of the painting into the room when her blood spills on it. And it's really interesting. And this creature basically comes out and says, there's a monster close by and I need your help to find this monster, because now in the world there are no monsters, like bad people who hurt other people, because they were all like eradicated. And so our main character's like, there's no monsters, like they're all gone, and the creature's like, no, there is one and you need to help me find it. And so they kind of team up to go on this adventure to find the monster basically. And it's a really interesting story. It's about queerness and it's about society and what it kind of means to be a monster. Very interesting stuff. Also, I think that our main character is queer, if I remember. I read this quite a few years ago. And I think she's trans. There's a lot of like discussions about that too, because she's pretty young. I think she's like elementary school age. But yeah, fabulous story. And now I think there's a prequel that's about her parents and how they met. And it's also set in the same world. Really good book, highly recommend. Kweke Emezi is also a fabulous author as well. And then next we have Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. So this is the first in I think it's an ongoing series. I don't think it's a trilogy. Maybe it is. I don't know. I haven't read the following books. But Gideon the Ninth is really good. It's a sapphic space story, sort of, and it also has necromancy, and it's a very unique novel. I don't think I've read anything quite like this, and I've read quite a bit of adult fantasy over the years, but we're following Gideon, and Gideon lives on this planet where people practice necromancy. And Gideon and the basically queen of this planet, end up having sort of a sapphic-ish relationship, but they're also in this world where there's a lot of action and there's a lot of like fight scenes and murders going on and like political stuff, and it's really kind of a lot going on, to the point where like, how much sapphic romance can you have when everybody's trying to kill you? You know what I mean? But anyways, so Gideon ends up going with this queen lady to another planet because there's this competition going on, and each planet sends like representatives to participate in this game, essentially. But the game ends up being a lot more than they think it is, and it's set in this basically mansion on this planet, and there's like different things they have to fight and clues they have to find, and then things get weird and people start dying, and then they're trying to figure out who's killing everybody else. It's almost one of those stories where it's so out there that you're like, do I understand what I just read? But it's really fun, and Gideon is really funny and very entertaining. And if you're into fantasy and fight scenes and necromancy and all kinds of weird stuff like that, you're going to be super into this book. It's very fun. It's one of those ones that I read as an ebook where I stayed up till like 2 or 3 in the morning to finish it because I needed to know what was going to happen, because the writing is that good. So next one I wanted to recommend is another one that I'm currently reading, and it's called How Far the Light Reaches by Sabrina Imbler. And this is a fantastic story. It is so well written that I don't even know if I can eloquently explain to you what it's about. But basically, it's a collection of essays, and each one is following a different sea creature. And our narrator tells us things about her life through these different sea creatures, basically. And so the essays are really good because they're talking about different topics. They're talking about queerness and identity, and there's a part about an eating disorder and all kinds of different stuff. And basically she's talking about her life and these sea creatures, and there's a lot of different scientific discussions in here about the sea creatures and their different habits, and also just like environmental stuff. So there's a lot of stuff in here about like whales and how many blue whales humans have killed. It's like 360,000, and just trying to wrap your head around that is crazy. But the author does a really good job of incorporating her own personal stories and anecdotes into these like really scientific marine biology excerpts, basically. So I feel like I learned a lot while reading this book, but also I really love essays like that where an author can talk about two seemingly unrelated things, like a really personal story and like the history of blue whales, and combine those into one essay and make it make sense, and you understand why she put these things together because they have similar themes. Or for like example, the habits of the octopus also are similar to like the habits that her mom had growing up, and all these different things. It's really fascinating. She talks in here about blue whales and these purple octopuses and feral goldfish and these sand striker creatures and all kinds of different things. There's also kind of discussions in here about the Me Too movement a little bit, and Chanel Miller, and sexual assault stuff, and queerness, and having like your first queer relationship, and coming out to your parents, and having like an eating disorder, and tying that back to like relationship with their mom, and all these different things. And it's really fascinating, very well written, beautiful descriptions in here of animals and sea creatures and places that this author lived, and all kinds of different things. It's really fascinating, very well written, absolutely like beautiful to read, to be honest. So if you're into essays or nonfiction at all, I think you should definitely read this. It's very queer. It's also just very enlightening, and it makes you think about a lot of different topics. And there's a lot of things in here that I didn't know about because this author is older than me. And so there's things in here like murder trials and different stuff and like stories that I'd never heard of before. And so it's really interesting the way that she tied those back to like different sea creatures. And you also get like a marine biology lesson at the same time. And it was fabulous. Highly recommend. I think this is probably one of my favorite books on this entire list. Next, we have another one, and it's called Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. So this book is another one that kind of changed my brain chemistry a little bit. So this is a gothic story, and it's about these two boys, and one of them dies, and the other one is like his best friend, and he is grieving his best friend aggressively, and he is kind of trying to unpack their relationship. And they kind of had this really strange relationship where they grew up together almost like brothers, but they also are like very clearly like gay for each other, but they never admitted it to each other. And our main character is basically feeling like he's being haunted by the ghost of his dead friend Eddie. And so he's like, he just can't escape it. He can't get it out of his head. He can't move on with his life. And so he's like, you know what? I think something is wrong here. Like, I don't think my friend committed suicide. I think somebody killed him or something. And so he decides he's gonna go and almost like walk in his best friend's shoes. And so he goes and enrolls in the college program that his friend was in, moves into his apartment with the roommates he had, like really inserts himself into his friend's previous life and tries to unpack like who would want to hurt him, what was going on, like who knows anything about like the state he was in at the end of his life. And he goes, and it's set in the South, and there's a lot of like Southern vibes. It's in the summer, it's hot, there's a lot of like car racing in here if you're into that. There's also a lot of different queer characters who are side characters, and our main character is like kind of exploring his own sexuality and trying to figure out what is going on in this town and trying to figure out what's going on at the school with the professors, because some of them seem kind of shady, and he's trying to figure out what's going on with this friend group his friend Eddie was a part of, because they're kind of weird. And the story just kind of goes from there, and it's basically kind of like a character study in a lot of ways of our main character. And there's a lot of discussions in here about grief, but there's also kind of some like nature horror-y vibes as well, because when they were kids something happened to these two boys, and after that they were able to like kind of see ghosts, and dead things were kind of like attracted to them, which is really creepy. So there's definitely some like spooky vibes. But I think if you are interested in explorations of grief, or if you like that like southern nature horror kind of vibe, this one is definitely for you. Next we have one, it's called The Queer Principles of Kit Webb. So this is a male romance, and this is one I read a while ago. It's by Cass Sebastian, and it's really lighthearted and fun. It's basically following this guy who runs a coffee shop and this other man whose father is this really like wealthy lord, and he's very abusive. And so one of the main characters, the son of the lord, he finds out that this coffee shop guy is an ex-highwayman, and he tries to hire him to kill his father. And the story kind of goes from there. There's a lot of queer vibes in here, and a lot of like pining and banter, and it's really fun. And the coffee shop guy basically says, I'm not going to kill your dad, like I'm out of the business, I don't do that anymore, but I will teach you how to kill him yourself if you would like to do so. And so there's a lot of like training montages in here and stuff like that as well, and it's very fun, very lighthearted, very just funny and entertaining. But the spicy scenes are very spicy. Like, this is not a fade to black male romance like a lot of other ones that I read, and I thought that was really interesting, so that's also part of why I put it on this list. And next up we have one called Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. So this one is a book that has been like in my noggin for many years, ever since I read it. So this is one I just randomly picked up at the library one time and had no idea what it was about. It's a very, very, very dark book. I don't think I can emphasize that enough. There's trigger warnings in here for absolutely everything. There's trigger warnings for abortion, for police brutality, for transphobia. My cat is climbing on the tripod. Can we take a minute to talk about that? Oh my goodness. Yeah, you smell like chicken and you're being a turd. As I was saying, Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, there are so many trigger warnings in here for everything. Abortion, police brutality, violence, transphobia, you name it, it's in this book. But it is extremely powerful, in my opinion. There's a lot of discussions in this book about generational violence, and it was originally written in Spanish and it was translated to English. So I think some of the writing is due to the translation, but it's a very odd book in every way, in my opinion. Just looking at it, it's very small, and so I thought it would be like a really fast, easy read. No, it's very dense. There's no chapters. It's just blocks of text the entire time, and it's very dark, violent, sad in so many different ways. But basically it's about this Mexican village, and there's a murder that happens in this village, and the person who was killed is called the Witch, and the witch was a trans woman, and basically she was killed and discovered by a group of children near a canal, and the whole village kind of is on this investigation to figure out how and why the witch was killed. And each chapter is following a different character, and they're all like unreliable narrators, and some of them are really awful people, some of them are good people that bad things happen to, but basically as the novel unfolds, you get to hear more and more of these like acts of depravity and brutality going on in this village, and it's sad, but you kind of get to see like the humanity in these characters, and you really like are rooting for some of them, and some of them you're like, oh my god, this is awful. And there's some of the characters in here who are queer. There's also trigger warnings in here for incest and like unwanted pregnancy and that kind of stuff, but basically it's a story about this village where there's a lot of really real violence going on in here that almost like seeps into the soil and like poisons the entire town, and it's terrifying, and a lot of the things in here are very real things that happen, and I think that's what makes it so scary and horrifying. But if you're looking for a book that's really impactful and it's going to make you think, and it's about generational trauma and all of the violence that can go on in this one town and just like the cyclical nature of it all, this is definitely a very interesting book. But I will say, like, read it only if you're in a really good headspace, because it's very dark and I don't want people to read this if they're not ready, because I read it having no idea what it was, and I was definitely not prepared, but also it was one of those books that stuck with me for a really long time. So that's Hurricane Season. I would recommend it if you feel like you can handle it. Next up, another one I wanted to talk about is called The Black Gods of Drums by P. Djeli Clark. So this is a novella, and this one is following a young black girl who lives in Louisiana, and it's set in this fantasy world that's kind of steampunk, and there's these airships and these different things, and she overhears these two men talking, and she is homeless, she lives in the streets, and there's these two dudes who are talking about this scientist guy who has this weapon, and they are trying to get their hands on it. And this girl is basically trying to get access to one of the airships, and so she's trying to appeal to one of the airship captains, who is this really tough woman. And so she goes to the woman and is basically like, hey, I know about this secret scientific weapon that could like hurt people, basically. And so she kind of trades the secret information to get on the ship, and the story kind of goes from there. But our main character also has the voice of this like Creole god that she hears in her head who talks to her, and I think she's the god of like wind and storms and stuff. And so the story kind of goes from there. There's a lot of magical elements, there's a lot of steampunk elements, and I really enjoyed it. Peter Shirley Clark was the author that I was really into a few years ago, and he has a lot of different novellas that have really good audiobooks on Hoopla, so this is one of those, and I definitely recommend it if you are looking for something, again, very short, very different. I haven't read very many books that have like steampunk vibes like that, especially with like the Creole Louisiana vibes as well. So definitely recommend that. And then I have two more. So one of the last ones is Delila Green Doesn't Care by Ashley Herring Blake. And this is a sapphic rom-com. And it's about this woman, Delila, who is going back to her hometown for her stepsister's wedding, and she doesn't like her stepsister, but she's going just because it's like a family affair, and she ends up meeting one of the bridesmaids who is this single mom, and they have like very different vibes, but they end up kind of falling for each other and having this really sweet sapphic romance. This is one that has really good reviews on Goodreads as well, so it's not just me who likes it, there's a lot of romance girlies who are into it as well. And I recommend that if you're looking for more of like a fun, lighthearted sapphic story. And then lastly, we have Burn Our Bodies Down by Rory Power. So this is one that I read quite a few years ago, but it's another YA horror, and it has this nature horror, like farm vibe, and it's really fun. It's about this girl who grew up with just her mom, and they again kind of have a similar relationship to the mom and daughter in Night's Edge, where it's kind of like emotionally manipulative and kind of toxic, and our main character is trying to find out more about her family. And this whole time the mom has been very secretive about her grandparents and the dad and all that. And so one day the girl is in like the garage, and she finds this box of her mom's old stuff, and she finds a photo of her grandma, and on the back's a phone number. So she calls it, and she gets a hold of her grandma, and she basically says, hey, like, I want to come meet you, you know, my mom will never tell me anything about you. And the grandma's like, yeah, sure, do it. And so the girl goes to her grandparents' house and like sneaks away from her mom, and she quickly realizes that maybe there's a reason why her mom didn't tell her about her grandparents, and there's some creepy stuff going on this farm that the grandma owns, and the story goes from there. and there's a lot of nature horror elements in here. There's some creepy stuff with a peach tree and a cornfield, so if you're into that, I would recommend this. It's very strange, but I really enjoyed it. I really like Rory Power's writing. She also wrote Wilder Girls. A lot of people don't like Rory Power because I think she kind of got canceled on Twitter like a few years ago. I don't even know if she writes books anymore, to be honest. But so the author, questionable. But if you're curious about this book, it's one that I really have enjoyed. And I also really liked Wilder Girls as well. So those are all of the queer book recommendations that I have for you today. Let me know in the comments if you have any book recommendations you think I would like. And I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!